You're listening to Consulting Logistics, presented by Freight Plus. I'm your host, Kyle McNaught. Thanks for checking us out. It's another SCU30 episode, and as I hit the microphone, you know it's going to be a fun day because we're going to be talking with professionals under the age of 30 currently working in the supply chain. Now, the supply chain goes everywhere. It's not just kind of truckers, carriers, brokers. There's a lot of interesting jobs in the supply chain. And today's episode is going to be a really fun one because I have Andrew Cameron, a communications professional interested in all things maritime to space, is going to join the show, and he's going to talk about his experience in the supply chain. In this conversation, Andrew's going to talk about what drove him to pursue a career in this industry, what experiences he had at one of the largest container terminals in the world, and finally, working on the Hill, like working in D.C. for the maritime industry. Is going to be a fascinating conversation. So we can already kind of hear his buddy in the background a little bit, but Andrew, how's it going?
It's going well, Kyle. Thanks for having me. Yep. You probably heard some bone drops. My working at home. I'm here with my lab, and it's kind of her witching hour right now. So apologize for any extra noise.
No worries. It's a dog pod. My dog's chilling with me somewhere around here, so she'll probably get up and do a shake right when it's important. So no worries about any of that stuff. But Andrew, I mean, really fun conversation. Really fun talking to you, kind of leading up to this. But let's jump right into it, man. Talk a little bit about kind of growing up. A little bit about your background and kind of what you were doing kind of growing up, school-wise, stuff like that. Yeah.
So pre-college, I grew up in Loudoun County, Virginia, in a suburb of Washington, D.C. I would call it a suburb, but it's really about an hour away from the district. Really just classic kind of East Coast town kind of style of living, lived in a suburb. Just enjoyed hanging out with my friends, hanging out in the creek as a kid, playing with Legos, playing sports, kind of like classic, not like small, mid-sized town kind of life.
Nice. Now, growing up, how was technology for you? That's kind of the fascinating thing, especially in this conversation that I've found is just, did you have a phone like right off the bat? Did you have access to internet, or was it in your family living room and you had to share it with everyone? What type of technology did you have growing up?
Yeah, so I got kind of lucky on the phone side of things. My sister had to wait till high school, but when my mom went back to work, she wanted to make sure she could reach me, so I wasn't getting into too much trouble. So I got one in middle school. Then once the iPhones became a thing, I think I got like the second iPhone in high school. Always had a computer available. So, remember the what was it called? AOL Instant Messenger kind of ping. Still remember that, as well as, XP and all the fun things with, Microsoft and all those capabilities. So, yeah.
How mad was your sister that you got the phone in middle school? I'm the oldest too of my family. So I know your sister's pain of like, I had to like beg, borrow, and steal to get this damn thing. And now all of a sudden, just because you want to contact the youngest one, I'm like, maybe they get their acting gear like I had to.
Right. Yeah. I didn't really hear much of it, but I'm sure my parents definitely heard it. I think that she... Being the youngest, I was just kind of used to like, always kind of, being like a little ahead of whenever the timeline was for my sister. So I think it probably drove her crazy.
I can imagine coming from this.
Right.
I know exactly. Talk to me a little bit about kind of schooling, stuff like that. What were your interests and kind of start to transition into what drove you like in college? Kind of what was your pursuit kind of wrapping up high school? And I know you attended James Madison, which is my wife's college. So kind of, how were you at school? What interested you? And then kind of what drove you into attending James Madison?
Yeah, so pre-college, really interested in history, as well as kind of all the art mediums. So photography, kind of just normal art, as well as kind of dabbled a little bit into computer graphics and things like that. So definitely had kind of like the history writing background, but also kind of that creative background as well. So looking at colleges, I really stayed looking at in-state schools in Virginia. Virginia has some of the best schools in the country. My parents were like, we're getting the best bang for our buck. So looking at schools in Virginia, I was really interested in architecture programs, and two of the best programs are in Virginia, at UVA and Virginia Tech. Unfortunately, they're also extremely difficult to get into. So wasn't able to get into the programs. And JMU was kind of, it was, if I wasn't going to go to architecture, JMU is a really good broad school for not only a solid education, but really just getting a really good background on, communication, how to, it just develops a really good professional that has also kind of a liberal arts background as well.
Right, so what was your kind of major heading into JMU? What were you thinking?
Yeah, so I was a international affairs major. So I had an interest in politics and history. And it was international affairs is really multidisciplinary. So, there was a lot of ways I could go with it. So I went into school wanting to do international affairs, and I stuck it out the 4 years.
So the interesting thing you mentioned, or you didn't mention, is nothing to do with supply chain. How the hell, like what happened? How did you end up getting over into kind of supply chain, maritime, that type of stuff?
Yeah, so I actually, as you probably know this, I fell into the industry, which I think a lot of professionals, do fall into it. I think that they don't. I don't think that supply chain programs 10 years ago really did a good job marketing themselves. Supply chain wasn't really sexy until really recently. And I kind of like to call it kind of like the Amazon effect. Like the more people learned about the amazing thing Amazon were doing, the more they learned about the industry. So so I didn't really have any background in supply chain. And when I was about to graduate from school, I joined a program with my church called the Young Adult Service Corps, which is kind of like the Peace Corps. And they send people around the world to do a year of mission work with a nonprofit. So, they knew I had a, international affairs background. So they partnered me with an organization called the Mission to Seafarers, which is Seafarers advocacy group. So I moved to Hong Kong, and that was kind of my deep dive into the industry. So like I said, I really just kind of fell into it because, I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do after school, but I knew that this program existed through my church, and I knew it would have been a great opportunity to get some international experience, while I was young.
So was that kind of what your plan was post-graduation? Just kind of like, let me get some international experience. I got this major that's international. Let's see how I can kind of contribute to the world with it.
Yeah, I was always really interested in giving back in nonprofits, and I wasn't sure exactly professionally what I wanted to do yet. Whether it was get into politics and in DC, or whether it was getting a master's degree, or working for an NGO or a nonprofit. So this was kind of when you don't have that many bills to pay and stuff like that, and I didn't have I didn't have a wife at the time. It was like, I can be a little selfish. I can move across the world. I can try something completely different that'll give me some experience that, not a lot of people can do. So I was very fortunate with it. And, it happened to just put me into the industry that I've stuck with my entire career.
That's fascinating. I mean, I've been recording a couple of these, and like as they're going to come out, people are going to hear, but it's interesting of the people needing to get real world experience. Like everyone's kind of attended college, they've done something, but the idea of like, I need to get an internship, I need to get this, that's where I found my passion. It's like such a fascinating thing, because we're all told, go to college, get the, like, this is the path, you go to high school, you got to go to college. And it's not that college isn't great, but it is stuff about experience. So let's transition over into your experience. Let's talk about Hong Kong. I mean, what are you doing there? That's crazy. I mean, it's one of those awesome things, right? It's kind of one of those, you're not wishing that you did something after that. Talk to me a little bit about your experience in Hong Kong.
Yeah, so my experience in Hong Kong was, kind of once in a lifetime. It's an absolutely incredible city. It's been in the news for many different reasons the past couple of years because of all the political tension. But I was there before all that happened. It's an extremely dense city. There are huge industries there. There's a huge finance industry, as well as one of the largest container ships in the world. So it's kind of, it's right in there next to right in China, right connected to China. So this whole supply chain of Pacific trade kind of feeds through parts of Hong Kong. Most of it's Shanghai, but some's coming from Hong Kong as well. So I just working for the Mission to Seafarers, I got really hands-on experience visiting terminals. I would drive a van through the terminal. Also, I would take my commute to work most of the time was jumping on a small boat, and we would take the boat out to harbor to visit the ships that weren't that were anchored we're in Anchorage and, couldn't get into the terminal yet. So I was
Right.
literally climbing up monkey ladders on the side of these container ships, and visiting seafarers, and really doing, like I said, it was advocacy work, but really it was just being an ear for these seafarers, saying, hey, our organization is looking out for you while you're in Hong Kong, and how can we help you?
That's crazy. So that's gonna be fun, because honestly, I've done like a little tour of the Boston terminal, like our little seaport here, and like that was one that I was like, oh my gosh, this is huge and stuff. I couldn't imagine going to Hong Kong with like the larger terminals and being like, what is happening? And then going to the vessel. I mean, especially right now when we're recording, like the ports are jam packed. There's like 40 ships waiting to just berth and get like offloaded and stuff. I mean, what was it like? Kind of, what was the energy like? Was it fat? Like, was it just fun to kind of get on these ships and sort of see how the world really kind of works?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fast-paced industry, and you could really see it, seeing it through the eyes of the seafarers. Like they work their butts off, and their contracts are months long. And the whole idea of the global supply chain is, the faster you can get a box from point A to point B, the cheaper it's going to be. And so our ports have optimized the ability to get ships in and out, which unfortunately the people who suffer in that are the seafarers, because they don't have as much time, at Anchorage to just relax. When they're in the port, they're working their butts off. So, they just really can't catch a break. So we were there to help, taxi them into the city so they could have a day off, or even just selling them a phone card so they could call home. So we were kind of, a lot of people visiting the ships had paperwork, and we're trying to just get them out as quickly as possible. And we were sitting down with them saying, hey, how can we help you?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I mean, you kind of almost found the way, like you talked about, like you kind of found a nonprofit without it being nonprofit, right? Like you
Right.
found this. So talk to me a little bit how this kind of that work and kind of understanding the plight of the seafarer, which is, I mean, a lot of people hear about this plight of the trucker and stuff, but the seafarer is another fascinating one, especially in a global supply chain. How did that translate into your work into the Hill? How did that transition happen?
Yeah, so working in Hong Kong, it was a 1-year contract. So I knew it was going to be a great experience, but I had to come home and figure out what I was going to do.
Yeah, you got a sick tan. Yeah, you got your tan. You're good. Like, you don't need to keep working on it.
Right, exactly. So so when I was back in the States, was back in Loudoun County, right outside of Washington D.C., and was really trying to figure out what was the next step. And, like you were saying about, young professionals, needing to get that intern experience, needing to get that professional experience. One thing I found it really hard when I moved back to the States was, translating that international experience to DC experience, because DC experience, you have to have worked in politics or known people that worked in politics. I didn't intern on the Hill when I was in college.
Right.
I had an international background, but it was like, that's cool, but like, do you want an unpaid internship? And I was like, no, I have a year of experience and I need to start paying my bills. I need to move out of my parents' house. So I worked a consulting job for I think it was only about 8 months just to pay the bills. And then I found the American Association of Port Authorities had a position open in communications. And, I was like, this is my opportunity to get back into the maritime industry. Because I was like, this is an industry that I know. It's kind of a niche industry, but once you know it, it's just a really, like, I feel like I can really make a career around it because I know the industry and because I know it's in and out. So that's how I got working in DC.
Yeah, you rolled up your sleeves. You actually did work. Like, you can talk to, like, hey, here's issues that they have on, like, in the boats. Here's the problems when they're like at Anchorage. Like, this is all these issues. It's got to be, must have been a fun conversation. Talk a little bit about what you were doing with the port authorities and kind of what your role was there and kind of what it was like advocating in DC for ports.
Yeah, so APA was kind of a traditional trade association. We supported and lobbied for all of the port authorities of the U.S. So when you think of all the big terminals, for instance, like you said, in Massachusetts, Massport, all the way from, a Massport to Port of Los Angeles, to even the Great Lakes, there's really tiny ports that are, moving tons of tonnage
Right.
out of the Great Lakes and, through Canada, basically. So I was working with professionals from all over the country, kind of learning the ins and outs of the kind of the American and Canadian and Latin America, but specifically a lot of it was working with the American ports,
Right.
learning the industry, learning, how we could help them. So we had kind of the lobbying arm. And then our trade association also did like professional development programs. So I met a lot of professionals and helped them, kind of gain some skills in an industry as well.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. I mean, just being able to see that. What was some main differences you saw with like the American ports versus what you kind of got to experience in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I guess like Hong Kong just felt like very business first, because I was in the terminals, and the terminals definitely feel that way in the US. But when you think of like a port authority, there's a lot of them are actually, they're more landlords than they are operating boxes. So there's two types of port authorities, and most of them are called landlord ports, and then there's operating ports. And so these landlord ports are leasing out their facilities to all these massive corporations that are moving boxes. And
Right.
a lot of that things that go into that are it's a lot of politics, urban planning. Really, ports are kind of a microcosm of the economy for their area. So Massport, like they probably do ferries too. They're kind of really ingrained into the public energy of the city, and there's technically like a pseudo government agency. So there was a lot of politics that went into it, kind of on the local level, but then regionally and nationally involved as well.
Wow. Honestly, I probably could ask you questions about Massport. That could be a whole separate
Sure.
thing. Like, all right, tell me about this, because I'd love to know how they're working this damn thing. One thing though that like as you talk, and I'm kind of finding like interesting, my just listening in on it is the idea that like you found this passion all through experience, and it's not an experience that necessarily is super long, right? I mean, you really only had a year in Hong Kong, and then you're able to kind of transition that into gaining more experience. Talk to me a little bit about like why that's valuable, and kind of what students and kind of any listener to this should be thinking about when it goes to like, hey, go out there and get experience.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I can learn about my experience is, really what I learned during that experience. I was surrounded by, I was in a new environment, a new industry, and I was surrounded by some pretty incredible professionals in that industry. And I think one thing that, that young people need to do is just ask questions and listen. I think that a lot of times that young people can be very timid in new situations. And the reality is, working professionals that have done the industry for 20 years, they want to share that experience. And frankly, in the maritime industry, there's a graying of the workforce, and there might not be like the best people to fill their jobs in 40 years. So they have this passion for the industry. And if you're young and you just listen and ask questions, I guarantee you that those professionals will give you the time of day, even if it's just through LinkedIn. We're in an environment where you can't meet face to face at like a cocktail hour or an industry event, but I've found even just reaching out to you and starting a conversation, like that's kind of how you learn in the industry and how you can develop that experience into the next thing.
I also find it interesting. I mean, you're put into a position of power, right? Like you're talking to lawmakers, you're talking to these people, but you are kind of young. You are that type of stuff. I find a lot of times you can be a little timid, right? You feel like, well,
Right.
I don't have the experience to be able to talk about this stuff. But at the end of the day, the sheer amount of information and knowledge that you gathered from 1 year of just getting in there, doing the work, this is stuff that I did that 20 years ago. And 20
Right.
years ago, we didn't have a phone on us. We didn't have any of these little fun things. And like, that's part
Right.
of the technology gap that I find super fascinating. And it's something that like in the industry, like I'm like 32, right? So it's one of those, like, as much as I'm learning about this stuff, I'm also starting to age out of like people who had technology much sooner than I did, who kind
Right.
of grew up with all this stuff and really can see what experiences are like. It's such an interesting thing to just not be timid. And then coming from someone who is talking to people of power, right? Like in my mind, I'm talking to my boss. It's a person of power. Oh no, I'm concerned. But you're talking to lawmakers. I mean, talk to me a little bit about when they have misconceptions. Like what type of misconceptions do lawmakers have? And then how are you able to kind of go to them and kind of explain the Port Authority's kind of point of view with things?
Yeah, so I wasn't a lobbyist, so I wasn't really having the conversation.
Right?
Yeah, so I wasn't having the specific conversation with lawmakers. I definitely did some work on the Hill for some committee meetings, doing some committee meeting work and some communication campaigns to help our lobbyists. But one thing I will say about that kind of misconception around the industry with some lawmakers is that, you know, we a lot of times we were asking money for infrastructure projects, so to really, you know, develop the docks, to get the to dredge out the channels so that bigger ships can get into port. So it's really moving dirt and paving roads, you know, kind of infrastructure money. And why in the world would a Kansas senator care about that? Why would someone in the middle of the country who, you know, isn't on the coast, who doesn't have to deal with that, what's the value to them of money going to Port Authority versus them? So, you know, it's really a supply chain story. It's not a maritime story, because, you know, how do our goods get there? Well, they get there, you know, they start in boat, and then, you know, once they're at the gate, they get on a truck or a train, and then they probably get onto a fulfillment center. Then they probably get on another truck, you know, XYZ. And then they get to Kansas, you know, for a cheap price. And then you get your bananas you still get your bananas in Kansas for, I don't know, like 60 cents a banana or whatever. So that's what kind of the story that we wanted to tell is, you know, this is why you should, even though you don't have water access, it still is important to you, your constituents.
Your constituents need stuff. They don't want it to be expensive. This makes, oh wow. I mean, that's kind of a fun thing. It must have been kind of cool when you started to get those pieces put together. And I would I know you moved over to Spire, which is the kind of next thing we want to talk about, but I would love to know what you guys are doing with like COVID. I mean, it almost seems like, here we go. Everything we talked about now, look at how important the supply chain was. Like this mattered. And you guys, like, for anyone who was like, why do my constituents in Kansas don't care? It's like, well, now they do, because they can't get toilet paper. All these issues that if we would have just invested when we were talking about it, some of this stuff would have been cleared up. It's one of those ahas. I love it. Like, great. Andrew just like made me like, oh yeah, that's a really great point about that type of stuff. Let's transition over to Spire, because this one's fascinating. I mean, you're working in space now. So you went from maritime to space. Talk to me about this. What are you doing with Spire right now?
Yeah, no, I just got completely bored with maritime and wanted to switch industries.
Conquer the ocean. Let's go air.
Right, exactly. Sign me up to Jeff Bezos to get on the next rocket. But no, so I had 3 years of incredible experience working at APA in D.C. And, you know, through that experience, I still wanted to grow professionally. And I figured it's always, when you're at a company for a little time, it never hurts to look elsewhere. Just if there's opportunities, especially when you're young, there's opportunities that arise. So I saw Spire Global. I saw a job opening, and it kind of was like maritime communications, and I was like, okay, like I've never seen those two keywords together, unless it's with like a port authority or a ship or a shipping company or a below deck. But yeah, so I was like, this is really fascinating. And then the more I looked into the company, I was like, like space companies, satellites. I was like, this is such a hot industry. And the fact that they're disrupting the maritime industry and other industries, I was like, this might be an amazing opportunity. So I kind of jumped on it. And, you know, through the interview process, it kind of, you know, the momentum I had was like, I was like, this is a perfect fit for me. I can see myself like really succeeding and adding value to this organization. So that's kind of how it started.
I love it. If listeners, write it down, take every meeting, especially when you're young, take them all, talk. What's the harm? There's no harm in talking. You went from like graduating international degree Sure. Well, let's go to Hong Kong. I want to go abroad. And then you kind of continue to move this thing. All of a sudden, now you're working in a disruptive field that really is fascinating, especially as we continue to speed up the supply chain. Talk to me a little bit about kind of the work you're doing and everything that Spire is kind of working with.
Yeah, so I'll give you kind of like a kind of elevator pitch overview of Spire as a company and then what I'm working on. But just one thing I wanted to mention, you kind of were talking about like my international affairs experience, and it's kind of all coming back together, because one thing that also attracted me to Spire Global was it's an extremely global company.
Mm-hmm.
We develop our satellites in Glasgow, Scotland. Most of my team is based in Luxembourg in Europe. And then we also have an office in Singapore. So, my maritime team, it's around 30, 35 professionals, and there's over 20 nationalities on that team. So it's just, when you think of like the global context, that was also, that was something that I was like, okay, like I kind of want to get back into that. So that was a nice caveat too.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So,
but yes.
Yeah.
But Spire Global, just to give a little background of the company and what I'm doing. So Spire Global, we are a satellite company that has incredible data and data analytics for different industries. And when I say satellite company, I'm not talking about the massive satellites that NASA would launch up 20 years ago that were billions of dollars. We're talking about cube satellites. They're about the size of a loaf of bread or like a wine bottle. So we have about over 100 cube satellites in orbit, basically pulling information in different industries around the world. So we're not talking massive satellites. We're talking about tiny, very powerful payloads that are calling a ton of data real time. We're slicing and dicing that data and sharing it with different industries.
Wow. And then, so what exactly kind of, I mean, I can immediately see what having real time data would do for a maritime kind of shippers and stuff. What exactly are you kind of working within them for them?
Yeah, so there's two major areas that we're working with in the maritime industry, and that is transportation data as well as maritime weather data. So when you think transportation data, there are, on every single ship in the world, there is an AIS receiver. So you can know where a ship is at any time, and know the name of it, know the vessel type. So our satellites are basically picking up AIS data of every single ship in the world. We're making trends. Our data is making trend analysis of where the ships are going, why they're going there, and we're selling that to a lot of different data providers, different shippers. We're selling it to a lot of people because the
Right.
data is really valuable.
And that didn't exist before? Like, I'm probably dumbing it way too down, but I'm assuming, to me, it sounds like it's essentially like radar, right? Here's where all the airplanes are in the field, like in the sky. That didn't exist for maritime?
It did exist. We just do it better than everyone else.
All right. Because I was like, oh my gosh. I'm like, wow, I really need to get caught up on what's happening in maritime. But so you guys are okay. That's awesome, man. That's like such a cool transition. It's such a cool find to kind of, as you continue your story through everything. Yeah, you said you were doing another thing, right? Or was it, you mentioned one? What's the other thing?
Yeah, the other big thing we do is we're collecting maritime weather data. So we're able to forecast weather on the open ocean. So it's really valuable, kind of knowing not only where a ship is, but what's around that ship. So, wave height, wind speed, things like that. Our satellites are able to pick up that information. So we're really packaging the data, to help, with kind of safety protocols, but, also trends and analysis, things like that.
It's just so interesting. And so, like, I guess we see as we start to wrap up. I'm so sorry, I got tongue tied because you say data. I'm sitting there thinking about weather trends and all this stuff.
Sure.
Let's start to wrap up. I mean, you're doing so much fascinating work. You've done such an incredible journey. I mean, what would you say? Like, how would you get started with this? Right? You kind of know how you got to place, and you understand that it was ping pong. It's not like a linear journey, right? You don't start off, you do this, that. If you could do it all over again, what would be kind of a different way you would kind of approach it, or what would be something maybe you wish you kind of learned that you didn't really pay attention to?
Yeah, are you talking about just professionally, or like when I started in the the like supply chain world.
Yeah, more the supply chain world. I mean, professionally, right? You kind of like you've made this journey. You've built your own kind of career, and you've
Right.
kind of done that type of stuff. But in the supply chain world, I mean, you kind of now, as much as like we've preached how important experience is, there's also
Mhm.
always you kind of think back like, man, I wish I kind of just when I had time to learn about this, I wish I learned
Right.
about it. Is there anything that you kind of thinking back to it now, you're like, man, I wish I would have paid a little bit more attention here in this type of thing?
Yeah, maybe looked more abroad when I was done with my Hong Kong experience. I think that would have if I could have gotten some experience in Europe or something like that. But I can't really think of anything, off the top of my head of what I would have done differently. I think starting a little before that in college, one thing I would have done differently like just to set myself up a little bit better professionally, is just starting to develop those relationships a little bit earlier. That's not to say, don't have fun in college and don't do all the great things, but I think even even if I just tried a little bit harder developing relationships with professors, or if like just them helping open doors in Washington D.C, things like that. I think that it's never too early to start developing professional connections.
Oh, 100%. You definitely develop those. Like LinkedIn's so important. I remember thinking
Right.
LinkedIn's where I put my resume, but like now kind of being in the world, you're like, oh no, it's for connections. I mean, that's how we connected, right? Like
Mhm.
utilizing that software, that platform is really important. What excites you the most? I mean, you're working on some cutting edge technology. What excites you the most, especially about working in supply chain?
Yeah, I think one thing that excites me about the industry is, there's just so much to learn and so much you can do in it. And it's not going anywhere. There's some industries like, I think like there's a trend that like accountants are going to be obsolete once our AI is good enough that they can do the work for you. But like there are ways to automate the supply chain, but like it's one of the, especially maritime, it's one of the oldest industries in the world. It's been around for forever and it's always going to be there. And it's always going to be changing. And so I think the digitalization of the industry, learning about the industry, it's just excites me. And I find myself like, I have I have newsletters that I read every morning that are, industry specific. And I just, I enjoy learning about it.
Yeah, no, I mean it's so interesting, right? Like you say, it's the oldest industry. It really is one of the oldest industries. It's something that, like, believe it or not, there's not as much technology, and like getting to kind of jump into it, learn it, but then also have expertise where you feel like you get to make a difference. It's got to be so much fun because
Right.
you're in there. You're like, okay, cool, I can really work on this type of stuff. Last thing, any advice you want to give to kind of the younger listeners? Anything in particular that really helped you out kind of as you continued kind of in this career path you've gone on?
Yeah, I think I've hit on it a few times, but I think I would just reiterate, just reaching out and developing connections and listening, whether that's like even if it's just on LinkedIn. I think there's a feature in LinkedIn where when you send a friend request, you can add a message, and if it's a reporter or someone who's big in the industry, like just shoot them a little kudos and say, hey, I really liked your post because of this reason. And then it's a conversation starter. Everybody likes a compliment here or there. So, that's just one way to start a conversation, even if it's just digitally. But yeah, I would really recommend just reaching out to professionals in the industry just to learn, to see if that's what you want to do. Because, there's a ton of tools out there that can really set you up for success. And it doesn't have to be, oh, I went to this university, like, which will set me up for this. Like, no, the personal connections you develop can pay dividends versus, some of those other things.
Yeah, I mean, you went to JMU, right? I mean, not like
Right.
JMU is not a giant, not knocking on JMU at all. My wife would
Sure.
kill me if I did, but it's one of those, like, it is what it is, right? Not a huge alumni base, but something that like it's personal connections, and that's what people want. And
Right.
yeah, I mean, like you say, like send a little thing. I would, if there's a reporter who's like so up their own butt about how important they are, that like if you as a college student's like, hey, read your article, I find this interesting, and they don't want to connect with you, you don't want to be connecting with that person anyways.
Right.
Like that's not a good, they're not going to help. They're not going to be part of like building up anything or like supporting anyone. So don't worry about it.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. Just one little anecdote on that. when I worked at AAPA, we had a annual convention every year, and pre-COVID, back in like October, I guess it was last year, at our annual convention, there was a student from a university in Georgia, and he was the youngest person at the Congress by years. He was the only student, and he would just go up to people and just have a smile on his hand and shake hands. And I can guarantee you that kid developed so many relationships, and he works for Home Depot on the corporate side. But I know that just his ability to talk to those port professionals paid off, and his personality helped. But I just know that that was huge for him, and I noticed it because I was like, wow, that kid's starting out early, and he's I still reach out to him on LinkedIn every once in a while, because I can just I just know that kid's he's gonna go places, and it's because of his ability to develop relationships.
Oh, for sure. But if you're shy and you don't like doing that type of stuff, there's other platforms, right? I'm believe it or not, I'm not the one who likes to go up to people. I'm very shy in real life. So right. I like the LinkedIn. I'll talk, I'll comment and all that type of stuff. But yeah, that's a fun little story. Andrew, tell people how they can get in contact with you. Let's make that connection, right? Yeah.
So Andrew Cameron on LinkedIn, also on Twitter at @andcoms.
Oh, awesome. All right. I'll include show notes. I'll kind of include links to all that type of stuff so people can get in touch with you. But Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
All right. Take care.
And that's our show. Are you a supply chain professional under the age of 30 interested in talking about your journey? Let me know in the comments section, and I'll be sure to have you on the show. In the meantime, subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching Consulting Logistics. I'm Kyle McNaught. Rock and roll.